Ethan Carter had always taken pride in the life he'd built. A decorated military veteran turned dedicated city official, Ethan found solace in the quiet suburbs, a haven from a world that often demanded more than it gave. His home, a charming mid-century modern house nestled on a tree-lined street, was not only his sanctuary, but also a testament to his relentless work ethic and the pursuit of a simpler, honest life. Every corner of his property had meaning. The meticulously maintained garden, the hand-painted front door, and even the modest porch lights he'd chosen to accentuate his home's character. His true passion, though, lay in his workshop where he lovingly restored classic cars, a hobby that had quickly become a community legend for its dedication to preserving history. But not everyone shared Ethan's affection for individuality and free expression. At the helm of the local homeowners association, HOA, stood Kerren, self-appointed enforcer of an endless list of rules and petty regulations. To Kerren, the neighborhood wasn't a collection of unique homes, but a canvas that needed to be painted in uniform shades of conformity. Kerren's reputation as the unyielding, entitled HOA president was well known. Her smug smile and relentless enforcement of arbitrary rules struck fear into even the most confident residents. It began on an ordinary Thursday morning. As Ethan sipped his freshly brewed coffee on the back porch, he noticed an envelope affixed to his door with meticulous precision. A final warning, notice citing a violation he'd never agreed to. The offense? His excessively charming porch lights, which Kerren claimed disrupted the HOA's prescribed aesthetic. Stunned and frustrated, Ethan rifled through the letter. The text was stern and unambiguous. Any deviation from the HOA's stringent rules would result in escalating fines, legal actions, and even the possibility of forced modifications to his beloved property. For a man who had sacrificed so much for his country and now for his city, the idea of having his personal taste dictated by a self-appointed bureaucrat was intolerable. Ethan's mind raced. He recalled that his entry into public service had been founded on fairness and respect for individual rights, a stark contrast to the authoritarian style of Kerren and her cronies. As he looked around his property, every lovingly restored detail and handcrafted ornament whispered the story of his dedication. Yet here was Kerren, determined to strip him of his individuality under the guise of community standards. The first confrontation was not an explosion of anger or violence. Rather, it was a simmering conflict between the values Ethan held dear and the oppressive rigidity of the HOA. Later that day, Ethan decided to confront the issue head-on. With his heart pounding, he stepped into the HOA office, a drab, overly sanitized room where Kerren reigned supreme. In the overbearing silence punctuated only by the hum of fluorescent lights, Ethan calmly laid out his concerns. "I understand rules are important," he began, voice steady. "But these guidelines must serve the community, not stifle the uniqueness of our homes." Kerren's eyes flashed with entitlement as she retorted, "Your house is part of a community, Mr. Carter. You signed up for these standards when you moved in." The exchange, though measured, carried the weight of a burgeoning war. Ethan realized that Kerren was less interested in dialogue and more in asserting control. In that moment, the first seeds of rebellion were sown, a silent promise to himself that he would not be bullied into compliance. Even as the HOA's overreach began with something as trivial as the brightness of his porch lights, Ethan's conscience stirred. His home was his refuge, and no bureaucrat would diminish its soul. That very night, as the summer twilight deepened, Ethan lay awake contemplating his next steps. The pristine order of his neighborhood, once a symbol of communal harmony, now felt like a gilded cage. He understood that Kerren's actions were just the beginning of a long, unwinnable battle for the hearts and minds of his neighbors. And so in the stillness of that suburban night, a quiet resolve took shape, a determination to fight back against the tyranny that threatened not only his property, but the very spirit of the community he loved. The next morning brought with it an unsettling chill that belied the warmth of the summer sun. As Ethan stepped outside, he discovered a fresh layer of tension had been added to his doorstep in the form of an official-looking envelope bearing the embossed seal of the HOA. This new notice wasn't as subtle as the previous warning. It detailed a series of fines, including a steep penalty for unauthorized property embellishment, a vague and ominous charge that targeted Ethan's cherished porch lights and even the carefully chosen landscaping. Standing in his driveway, Ethan felt the weight of bureaucracy, as if it were a physical burden. Kerren had orchestrated this first power move with the precision of a seasoned tactician. The letter warned of immediate legal action if Ethan did not comply with the ever-tightening regulations. Our community thrives on uniformity and respect for established norms, the letter read, leaving no room for negotiation. As if to underscore her authority, a stern-faced HOA inspector appeared on Ethan's property later that day, clipboard in hand, meticulously noting every perceived infraction. Kerren herself made an appearance, dressed in a crisp blazer and an expression that blended superiority with smug satisfaction. She approached Ethan with a condescending smile. "The rules apply to everyone equally, Mr. Carter," she insisted. "Your refusal to conform not only undermines the community's standards, but also sets a dangerous precedent." Ethan, his pulse quickening but his tone measured, responded that he was well within his rights as a homeowner and that local zoning laws provided ample protection against such overreach. The encounter quickly became a spectacle. Neighbors peeked from behind drawn curtains, curious about the unfolding drama. While some expressed silent support for Ethan's right to individuality, others hesitated, fearful of incurring Kerren's wrath. Behind the polished veneer of HOA order, there lurked a deep undercurrent of resentment, a tension born of long-standing grievances that Kerren's iron grip had only exacerbated. Later that week, as Ethan went about his daily routines, small reminders of the HOA's power manifested everywhere. A freshly posted bulletin on the community board detailed the latest rule clarifications, and several houses reported receiving similar fines for what many considered trivial matters. The HOA's campaign was relentless. Warnings, fines, and even the threat of legal repercussions were wielded like weapons against any dissent. Ethan, armed with years of experience in public service and a deep-seated belief in justice, began researching local ordinances and zoning codes. He discovered that many of the so-called violations were not violations at all, but rather interpretations stretched thin by Kerren's selective enforcement. With each page he turned, his resolve solidified. He gathered printed copies of the relevant laws, determined to use them as shields against the unwarranted fines and threats. In the evenings, Ethan would sit at his battered oak desk, surrounded by legal documents and notes, and draft responses that were both respectful and pointed. His correspondence with the HOA was meticulous, citing specific statutes and questioning the legitimacy of each charge. Despite his calm demeanor, a simmering fury fueled his determination. Every letter he sent was a quiet protest, a declaration that the rights of a homeowner should never be compromised by a single person's overzealous interpretation of community standards. Yet, even as Ethan prepared his legal defenses, Kerren's power play continued unabated. The HOA began circulating rumors among residents that Ethan was deliberately defying the rules, painting him as a troublemaker who endangered the harmony of the neighborhood. In hushed conversations at block parties and over backyard fences, neighbors wondered if Ethan's resistance might eventually bring them all under the scrutiny of the HOA. The atmosphere was charged with uncertainty, a community caught between loyalty to its own identity and the oppressive force of uniformity. As the first week drew to a close, the initial battle lines had been drawn. Ethan's determination to stand up for his rights was met with Kerren's unyielding commitment to enforcing a rigid set of rules that no one had truly agreed upon. The clash was inevitable, and for Ethan, it marked the beginning of a long, arduous fight against a system that valued control over compassion. In the days that followed, the battle between Ethan and the HOA took on a new, more insidious tone. Kerren, emboldened by her initial successes, began to push the boundaries further. What had started as a series of petty fines soon escalated into a barrage of false violations and outright threats. Notices appeared overnight warning Ethan of imminent property seizure and forced compliance, each document written in a tone that left little doubt. the HOA was willing to trample on individual rights for the sake of their so-called community aesthetic. Ethan's suspicions grew as he noticed irregularities in the way the HOA operated. Neighbors, once silent or mildly concerned, began to murmur about inconsistencies. Whispers in the cul-de-sac hinted that Kerren's decisions were not based on any legitimate guideline, but were instead arbitrary and, at times, downright illegal. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan set about investigating the inner workings of the HOA. His inquiries led him to discover that funds earmarked for community improvements were disappearing, money that was, by all rights, meant to benefit everyone. There were rumors that Kerren was diverting these resources to fund her own extravagant tastes and to enforce her personal vendettas. Late one night, after a long day of sifting through obscure municipal records and outdated meeting minutes, Ethan received an anonymous tip. A soft-spoken board member, troubled by what she'd seen, discreetly handed him a series of documents that painted a damning picture. Kerren had been using the HOA's funds for personal expenses, including lavish dinners, expensive gifts, and even payments to local contractors for projects that never materialized. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling enough to convince Ethan that the entire system was rigged against the residents. Motivated by a sense of duty and justice, Ethan began to set up discreet cameras around his property, not just to document any further harassment, but also to capture any illegal activity perpetrated by the HOA. He installed small, nearly invisible devices in strategic locations, near the mailbox, facing the front yard, and even pointed subtly toward the side gate. Each night, as he reviewed the footage, Ethan's frustration transformed into a cold, calculated resolve. He was not just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every homeowner who had ever felt powerless under the weight of unreasonable regulations. During the next HOA meeting, a gathering that had quickly become a battleground of ideology, Kerren's demeanor was even more imperious than usual. With her arms folded and a dismissive wave, she addressed the assembly. Any homeowner who dares question the rules of this community jeopardizes the very fabric of our neighborhood's integrity. Her words were met with uncertain nods and nervous glances, but a few braver souls began to murmur in dissent. Ethan, armed with his evidence and legal research, sat quietly in the back of the room. He knew that every misstep by Kerren only further validated his cause. After the meeting, a few board members approached him privately. Their voices were low, laden with regret. "We never signed up for this level of tyranny," one whispered. Another admitted, Kerren's decisions seemed to favor her interests over the community's well-being. These clandestine confessions provided Ethan with the critical support he needed. They hinted that even within the ranks of the HOA, not everyone was comfortable with Kerren's unchecked power. In the midst of this escalating conflict, Ethan's daily life became a delicate balancing act between public duty and personal perseverance. Every phone call, every letter, and every late-night session of video review chipped away at the walls of oppression that Kerren had built. With each piece of evidence, the prospect of a counterattack grew stronger, and the seeds of rebellion began to sprout among the residents. Though the shadow of the HOA's reach loomed large, the community was slowly awakening to the reality of their situation. Ethan's investigation was no longer just about defending his porch lights or his garden. It had become a mission to restore dignity and fairness to a neighborhood under siege. With legal documents in hand, camera footage stored safely on a hidden drive, and the quiet support of fellow homeowners, Ethan prepared himself for the next phase of the battle, a phase where the stakes would be higher, and every act of defiance would reverberate through the corridors of power. One cool autumn morning, as the golden sunlight filtered through the trees lining his quiet street, Ethan stepped outside with the hope of an ordinary day. Instead, he was met with a sight that sent a jolt of disbelief through his veins: a massive semi-truck, its imposing bulk parked squarely in front of his driveway, completely blocking access to his home. The truck's presence was not accidental. It was a calculated move orchestrated by Kerren to force Ethan's hand. A hastily scrawled note attached to the cab read, "Temporary parking for community improvement. Compliance required." Ethan's heart pounded as he took in the absurdity of the situation. The very driveway that had witnessed years of memories, from family barbecues to quiet moments of reflection, was now usurped by a hulking piece of machinery that symbolized the unchecked power of the HOA. Kerren's message was clear. She was prepared to go to any lengths to enforce her interpretation of community standards. This was more than a mere violation. It was an act of intimidation. Without hesitation, Ethan dialed his trusted towing service. His voice, usually calm and measured, carried an edge of determination as he explained the situation. "I need a tow truck out here immediately," he insisted, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Within minutes, a tow truck arrived, and the semi was towed away amid a gathering crowd of curious neighbors. The removal of the truck was not just a practical victory. It was a defiant slap in the face of Kerren's authoritarian rule. Word of the incident spread quickly. Neighbors, emboldened by Ethan's willingness to stand up against an absurd overreach, began to speak openly about their own grievances with the HOA's management. At the next HOA meeting, which had already become a charged environment, Ethan walked in carrying a meticulously compiled file of legal documents and video footage from his cameras. The meeting room fell into an expectant hush as he calmly presented the evidence. Clear images of the semi-truck blocking his driveway, the fraudulent note pinned to it, and his documented attempts to resolve the situation peacefully. "Today, I'm not just defending my right to access my own property," Ethan declared, his voice resonating through the tense room. "I'm standing up for every homeowner who has been bullied by arbitrary decisions and bureaucratic tyranny." His words were met with a mixture of applause and uneasy silence. Some board members exchanged glances, while others shifted in their seats, clearly torn between loyalty to Kerren and a growing sense of injustice. Kerren, who had expected nothing less than immediate submission, found herself on the defensive. With a forced smile, she retorted, "This is a temporary measure for the greater good. Imagine if every driveway was left unmonitored." But her argument crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Ethan calmly cited local ordinances, zoning laws, and the documented abuses of power that had been building for weeks. The balance of power was shifting in real time. As the meeting progressed, more neighbors began to voice their support. A longtime resident recalled an earlier incident when another homeowner was similarly harassed, and another questioned the logic behind blocking access to a private driveway under the guise of community improvement. The mounting dissent painted a stark picture. Kerren's regime was losing its grip, and the residents were reclaiming their voices. Outside the meeting, in the bright afternoon light, Ethan took a moment to reflect on the day's events. The semi-truck incident had marked a turning point, a definitive act of defiance that galvanized the community. His property, once a quiet haven threatened by arbitrary rules, had become a symbol of resistance against oppression. Though the battle was far from over, the victory of that morning was a powerful reminder that no one should ever be forced to sacrifice their rights in the name of conformity. Ethan knew that Kerren's response would only become more desperate, but he was ready. With his evidence safely stored, his legal research at the ready, and a growing band of supporters behind him, he resolved to continue the fight. The driveway incident had not only cleared a physical blockade, it had opened a path toward reclaiming the dignity and autonomy of an entire community. As the conflict with the HOA deepened, Kerren's actions grew increasingly erratic and desperate. Determined to reassert her authority and salvage her crumbling facade, she resorted to measures that bordered on the illegal. In one of her most audacious moves yet, Kerren decided to involve law enforcement in her campaign of intimidation. One early morning, she dialed the police with a series of fabricated complaints, a medley of alleged disturbances, noise violations, and even a claim that Ethan's recently installed security cameras were spying on neighbors. When the police arrived, the situation turned almost surreal. Ethan greeted them calmly at his door, his arms folded and a collection of legal documents tucked under his arm. "Officers," he said, flashing his official identification, "I can assure you there is no disturbance here. My cameras are strictly for my personal security, and I have every right to monitor my property." The officers, visibly exasperated by the baseless accusations, questioned Kerren's motives. A tense exchange ensued in which Ethan's collected evidence from previous incidents was laid bare for all to see. In the chaos that followed, Kerren did not retreat quietly. Instead, she escalated her tactics further by hiring a private investigator to dig up so-called dirt on Ethan. Late one night, as Ethan reviewed the latest footage from his cameras, he noticed an unfamiliar figure skulking near his garage, a shadow moving with calculated stealth. Fueled by a mix of anger and determination, Ethan confronted the man the next day. The confrontation led to an altercation that was quickly diffused by local authorities, but not before the footage was recorded and safely stored on Ethan's backup drive. At the next HOA meeting, a gathering that had now taken on an air of high drama, Kerren's desperation was palpable. She launched into a tirade, accusing Ethan of all manner of misdeeds, from endangering public safety to conspiring with outsiders to undermine the neighborhood. However, when Ethan projected the incriminating security footage of the private investigator caught red-handed snooping around his garage, the room erupted in gasps and murmurs of disbelief. The evidence was irrefutable. Kerren's latest attempt to besmirch Ethan's name had backfired spectacularly. In a final bid to salvage her reputation, Kerren tried to redirect the blame. "These actions are in defense of our community," she declared, her voice rising in a frantic crescendo. "If you can't handle a little extra vigilance, maybe you should reconsider your responsibilities as a homeowner." But the damage was done. The room, filled with residents who had quietly endured years of arbitrary rules and humiliations, no longer accepted her justifications. Their eyes spoke volumes of disillusionment and anger. That night, as Kerren returned home to a once pristine house, now marred by the scars of public humiliation, she realized that her final desperate move had sealed her fate. The very tools she had used to enforce her control, fraudulent complaints, unauthorized surveillance, and false police reports, had now become her undoing. For Ethan, each act of defiance had added another brick to the path leading to justice, and Kerren's attempts to intimidate were now the evidence of her overreach. The community, emboldened by Ethan's steadfast courage and the mounting pile of documented abuses, began to rally more openly. Neighbors who had once cowered in silence now spoke with conviction, and the HOA's veneer of order started to crumble under the weight of its own corruption. As the echoes of Kerren's desperate declarations faded into an uneasy silence, it became unmistakably clear. The era of intimidation was drawing to an end, and Kerren's reign was poised to fall. The turning point came swiftly. What began as isolated incidents of overreach transformed into a full-scale community revolt. In the weeks following the dramatic exposé at the HOA meeting, an unprecedented wave of solidarity swept through the neighborhood. Homeowners, previously divided by fear and uncertainty, united under the banner of reclaiming their rights and restoring the true meaning of community. Led by Ethan's quiet determination and armed with incontrovertible evidence of Kerren's corruption, the residents organized a special meeting, one that would determine the future of the HOA once and for all. At this gathering, held in the modest community center that had seen too many contentious debates, the air was electric with anticipation. Ethan took the stage, his voice calm yet resolute. "For too long, we have allowed a single individual to dictate the way we live," he proclaimed, glancing around at faces both young and old, all reflecting the same deep-seated desire for change. "We are not just residents, we are a community, and it's high time we take back control." His words resonated like a rallying cry, stirring feelings of empowerment and unity among the crowd. As the meeting unfolded, it became clear that Kerren's grip on power was slipping. One by one, board members, some of whom had long harbored private doubts about the legitimacy of her methods, stepped forward to denounce the abuses they had witnessed. Testimonies poured in, tales of arbitrary fines, intrusive inspections, and financial irregularities that pointed to a systematic mismanagement of funds. The damning evidence, painstakingly gathered by Ethan over months, left little room for denial. In a historic vote that seemed to echo with the collective voice of a liberated neighborhood, Kerren was unceremoniously ousted from her position as HOA president. The fallout was swift and uncompromising. Within days of the vote, city officials launched an investigation into the HOA's practices. The revelations were explosive. Not only had Kerren abused her power, but several board members were implicated in schemes that siphoned community funds for personal gain. The scandal that had once simmered beneath the surface now erupted into a full-blown crisis. Press releases, local news reports, and even social media buzzed with the story of an HOA that had betrayed the trust of its residents. Ethan, though exhausted by the relentless battle, found solace in the community's triumph. Each fine letter, each unwarranted inspection, and each act of intimidation had built toward this moment of collective vindication. As the HOA's corrupt structure crumbled, the residents began the slow process of rebuilding not just their finances, but their sense of community and mutual respect. Neighbors who had once whispered their discontent in hushed tones now met openly to discuss improvements and share ideas for a truly democratic association. For Kerren, the consequences were as inevitable as they were humiliating. Overnight, the very assets that once symbolized her authority, her manicured lawn, her custom-tailored suits, and even her once prized vehicle, became relics of a past defined by arrogance. Public opinion turned sharply against her, and as legal actions piled up, she was forced to resign and ultimately sell her home at a fraction of its value. The once feared enforcer of HOA mandates was now reduced to a cautionary tale of unchecked power and its inevitable collapse. In the aftermath, Ethan found himself quietly reflecting on the journey. He had never sought personal glory. His fight was always for the broader principle of individual rights and community integrity. Yet, as he sat on his front porch, now bathed in the gentle glow of dusk and surrounded by neighbors who shared a relieved smile, he couldn't help but feel a profound sense of victory. The battle against tyranny had been arduous, but justice had prevailed. And with that, the oppressive chapter of the HOA was finally closing, leaving behind lessons that would guide the community for years to come. In the weeks following Kerren's ousting, the legal repercussions for the HOA began to unfold with decisive clarity. City officials, acting on the damning evidence collected by Ethan and corroborated by multiple testimonies from disillusioned residents, levied substantial fines against the board. What had once been a loosely enforced set of guidelines was now recognized as a pattern of systemic abuse of power, a pattern that was not only unethical but also illegal. A class action lawsuit was soon filed on behalf of the homeowners, with Ethan at the forefront, lending his legal expertise and unwavering commitment to justice. The lawsuit detailed the misuse of funds, the arbitrary fines, and the consistent overstepping of municipal authority. Public records showed that several board members had benefited financially from the scheme, a fact that only deepened the outrage among the residents. As the legal proceedings advanced, news outlets picked up the story, and the once secret operations of the HOA were laid bare before the public eye. The courtroom drama was as intense as it was cathartic. During one particularly pivotal hearing, Ethan presented a meticulously organized portfolio of evidence, receipts, recorded communications, and photographic documentation that traced every step of the corruption. His calm and measured delivery, underpinned by irrefutable legal arguments, left little doubt among the judges that the HOA had operated outside the bounds of lawful governance. One by one, the officials ruled in favor of the homeowners, levying hefty fines and mandating structural reforms within the organization. For many residents, the legal victory was more than a mere financial settlement. It was a resounding affirmation of their rights as citizens. The sense of empowerment that had begun with a single act of defiance now radiated throughout the community. Neighbors organized forums to discuss future improvements, and the new HOA board, elected in the wake of the scandal, promised to uphold transparency, accountability, and fairness. The old regime was not simply dismantled. It was replaced by a structure that prioritized the well-being of every homeowner over the ambitions of a single individual. Ethan's final power move came in the form of a heartfelt speech at a community celebration held in the freshly renovated town hall. Standing before an audience of resolute faces, he emphasized that this legal victory was not just about punishing wrongdoing, but about restoring trust. Today we reclaim not only our funds and our rights, he declared, but the very spirit of community that was nearly lost to authoritarianism. His words echoed with hope and conviction, inspiring a sense of unity that would guide the neighborhood in the years ahead. As the legal consequences continued to unfold, fines were paid, lawsuits settled, and board members faced disciplinary actions, the old culture of intimidation and secrecy gave way to one of openness and mutual respect. The HOA, once a symbol of oppression, now stood as a cautionary reminder of what could happen when power is allowed to run unchecked. While the legal and communal reckoning rained down on the HOA, Kerren's personal life began to unravel in parallel. Once the unquestioned enforcer of draconian rules, she now found herself isolated and publicly shamed. The headlines in the local papers depicted her as a cautionary tale, a woman whose hunger for control had cost her not only her position, but also her credibility and reputation. Friends and allies distanced themselves. Even those who had once been intimidated by her abrasive manner now openly condemned her actions. In the weeks that followed, Kerren's every move was scrutinized. Rumors spread about financial mismanagement, and long-hidden personal issues began to surface. Neighbors recounted whispered stories of a woman who had once lived a life of quiet dignity before succumbing to the allure of power, a stark contrast to the unyielding persona she had crafted as the HOA president. As her house was put up for sale at a drastically reduced price, the signs of her downfall became all too apparent. The lavish dinners, the expensive custom suits, and even her prized car, all symbols of her former authority, lost their luster in the harsh light of public opinion. For Ethan, watching Kerren's collapse was a bittersweet moment of poetic justice. He had never taken pleasure in anyone's misfortune, but the scale of Kerren's hubris had left little room for sympathy. At community gatherings, residents spoke of the Kerren era in hushed tones, as though recalling a bad dream that they hoped never to repeat. Even as the HOA reformed and a new leadership emerged, the memory of Kerren's tyranny served as a reminder of the importance of accountability and fairness. In a final twist of irony, a local property management company, a firm once admired for its strict adherence to outdated rules, hired Kerren as an assistant property manager. The community's reaction was instantaneous and scathing. Ethan, reflecting on the turn of events, remarked dryly to a friend, "I guess sometimes life has a way of making you follow the very rules you once tried to break." His words, delivered with a wry smile, encapsulated the essence of Kerren's downfall. A woman who once prided herself on controlling others was now forced to live under the shadow of her own ruined reputation. Kerren's personal life, once meticulously curated to project an image of unassailable authority, was now in tatters. The divorces, financial woes, and public scorn painted a portrait of a person undone by her own overreach, a stark contrast to the confident figure she had once been. In the end, the fall of Kerren was not merely a consequence of legal penalties, but a profound lesson in humility and the inevitable triumph of justice. Some months later, the neighborhood had settled into a new rhythm, a quiet, unburdened way of life unmarred by the specter of an oppressive HOA. Ethan often found himself on his well-lit porch, the gentle hum of evening conversations and the distant laughter of children forming a soothing backdrop to his thoughts. His home, once a battleground, had become a symbol of resilience and the power of community spirit. Neighbors gathered for impromptu barbecues and shared stories of the tumultuous past, all united by the knowledge that they had reclaimed not only their properties, but their dignity. One crisp evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a longtime friend strolled up to Ethan's porch carrying a faded envelope. In a playful tone, the friend handed it over. "I guess we can't completely escape the past," he joked, winking as he referenced the notorious violation notices of yore. Ethan's lips curled into a knowing smile. With a measured, almost theatrical pause, he opened the envelope to reveal a mock HOA violation notice, an inside joke among the residents that symbolized how far they had come. "They really tried," Ethan quipped, his voice resonating with a mix of amusement and triumph. In that light-hearted moment, the weight of months of struggle lifted. The once oppressive bureaucracy had been vanquished not merely through legal action, but by the collective will of a community that refused to be bullied. The final mic drop was not a grandiose declaration, but rather the quiet, shared laughter of neighbors who had reclaimed their lives. As the evening deepened and the stars emerged one by one, Ethan sat back and savored the peace he'd fought so hard to achieve. The battle had been long and fraught with tension, yet it had forged bonds that would last a lifetime. The memory of Kerren's tyrannical rule, once a source of bitter anger, had transformed into a rallying cry for change, a reminder that every person had the right to live freely without undue interference. And so, with the gentle hum of community life surrounding him, Ethan Carter's story became a legend of resilience and justice, a beacon for anyone who ever faced the heavy hand of authority. Fade to black.